Good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Please let us know in the chat column. We're delighted to be joined today with Professor John Hattie, or John, as we will call him from now on, and Katie's with us as well. Today we're looking at putting learning first and centre. There's been obviously major challenges. And if it's good evening to you, good evening. If it's good morning to you, good morning, or good afternoon, or hello, middle of the night, and thank you for staying with us. That's really cool. So the challenges have been kind of put upon us very strongly through COVID and the pandemic and what comes through, and what we're seeing out of it is quite a massive change in education, the way we look at it and the way that children perceive it and parents perceive it as well. So what we're going to look very much to do today at is unpicking what does it look like if you're going to put learning first and centre, and what's necessary to do that. And it's just massively fantastic to have John with us today, because he sees into, I think it's about 20 countries that you're working with at the moment, John, in terms of advising on and looking through what is possible, and had undertaken a lot of the research on previous disasters around the world to understand. And so that a lot of the visible learning work had been made around that. And what we're going to also do is unpick the 5 major tenets that sit behind visible learning, because these are completely applicable within this situation if we're going to develop learners. So good morning, John, and welcome. Sorry, just before I start, anyone in the chat room, just bang in any questions that you want as we go through, and we'll try and deliver those. We've got some slides to help explain these a little bit, and we're going to be getting through an awful lot today, and Katie will join us a little bit later. Okay, so John, good morning. Sorry.
Good morning to you, Steve. Good morning to Katie. Good morning to everyone.
So the challenge we've set ourselves, John, today is learning first and centre, and what does that one look like? And how do we put learning first? So I just wonder if, first of all, you can just say, one of the big messages that you'll put forward is teachers will teach in different ways. Why is learning so important, and why do we need to shift away from teaching in the input to more of the receiving?
Well, certainly, Stephen, it's the notion that, yes, teachers do teach in different ways. And I think we've long had a debate about the best ways to teach. But I want to move the discussion beyond that and talk about what the impact of that teaching is, particularly on the learning lives of students. Like at the moment, I'm working a lot with many of what's now called Global South, and we used to call developing countries. And they've invested incredibly over the last 20 years in schooling. But sadly, virtually nothing in learning. So they're not getting much dividends from it. And that's a good message for all of us, is how do we make sure that we invest in impacting on the learning? And that then raises that question. And it's I get a lot of criticism about calling my work visible learning, because many have argued that learning is not visible. And they're right. It happens in here. But the reason I called it that was to put that incredible, relentless focus on trying to get that learning to be more visible, for students to hear how other students are learning, to hear how the teacher is thinking, so that the teacher can hear how the student is thinking and how they're going processing and what strategies they're using. Because that's the essence of what our job is to impact on the nature of learning. Of course, it's learning about something. But sometimes we focus too much on the about something through our curriculum and through our assessment, and we forget that it's what's going on here that we want to influence the most.
And I think, coming from some of your work, what's happening here, and I really like this notion that learners are already part formed before we get them. They're not an empty vessel there to just be dropped into, and they already have developing learning strategies going on in there.
Yeah, and like when we did our analysis a few years ago, we identified 450 different learning strategies, and to ask which ones were more effective, it turns out that some are more effective at certain times than others in the learning equation. So that's a big ask of some students, to have not only multiple strategies, but to know when to apply them. And like, no surprise, Stephen, we've got academics' fancy names for it. We call it self-regulation, kind of metacognition. And sadly, too often, when students have those skills, we assume they're the bright students. Whereas the aim of the whole work that we do is to say every student should be taught those skills, should be taught how to develop those skills, should be taught when to use them. And that's the hard part of learning, but that's the right job.
Great. So what we're going to do is start to unpick that. So almost we're going to tackle this in reverse order. Look at the 5 tenets of the visible learning that are coming out that we're seeing the most impact from, particularly in the UK through the work that we're doing with now thousands of teachers, hundreds of schools. So it's absolutely fascinating. And then we're going to take it back through the pandemic and work out, okay, well, how do we actually develop this, given that it may need to be remote, it may be face-to-face at times occasionally, which would be great. And other times it's going to be that kind of hybridization between those. So I'll just start now with pulling up these slides, so at least you can see, where we're looking at. So what we said is the areas we're going to look at first is that this learning first and centre. What do we mean by learners and the learning? Then we're going to look at the sustainability through alignments, because we've got so many processes going on in education at the moment, and it's very difficult to get your head around as many as it's that level of complexity that's developing, and how can we use that level of complexity to our advantage rather than it become problematical and an overload situation. We'll then look at the implication for leadership at all levels, and then through to teacher development through the Mindframes work you've been doing. And that is different from mindset, for those who are new to this area. And then lastly, we're going to be looking at the better outcomes. What does impact look like? Because we use this word. And what does impact on dispositions look like as well? Because we want to create better learners as well. So the first one we'll start off there then, John, was this kind of learning first at centre. What do we want it to look like if we can have fantastic learners? And I know this slide may help in terms of where we're at. So I wonder if you could just talk people through this and why you pull this together.
One of the fascinating things about teaching in a COVID environment, and when kids are at home and parents are involved in various ways, I think the most powerful learning that's come from that is parents have been reminded that it's all about sharing the language of learning. And I think that's really interesting as parents realise, clearly they should have because they were at schools themselves, that learning's messy. Learning is about what you don't know. Learning is taking on challenges. It's building up confidence. There's also a massive joy in learning. And so what we're trying to get here is to look at those components of the learner, starting with the various learning dispositions. And it kind of relates to the motivation that kids have to learn. And I take the very strong line that as you start to learn, you become motivated, not the other way around. And so how do we get kids to experience that thrill of learning? And this is where assessment comes into the equation. Assessment not only...
John, just to interrupt you there. You said as you start learning, you get motivated, not motivate first and then learn, which is the kind of engagement bit. Go on. Sorry,
Well, yeah, just on that, to reinforce that notion, when we ask teachers what they mean by engagement, too often, sadly, they say engagement is when kids are doing things. Kids are engaged when they're doing the task. In a lot of doing, sometimes there's not much learning. And so the motivation comes from, if I taught you a bit of a skills even, and you start to get some success, you want to have more success. And that's why I'm arguing motivation follows success and learning, not precedes it. And then it goes on to, how do we know? How do we teach the students to evaluate their progress? Now, that means we have to be very good at discovering where they are now. We have to be very transparent with them up front about what success looks like, so that when they get feedback, when they do assessment, they know about their progress. And then it goes on to this whole notion of understanding how we learn. Asking a student when they've done a problem, tell me how you went about solving it. Or giving them a problem, like a maths problem, with a wrong answer in it, and saying to them, work out how that student got the wrong answer, and getting them to start to build a language, talking aloud about what learning is. For too many students, learning is silent. Learning is what happens up here. They keep it silent, they don't expose it, and then when they get into a problem, they think they're the silly one. Well, actually, they're not. They haven't been taught the different kinds of strategies. They haven't been taught a language. And so walking into a class and hearing kids thinking aloud is one of the most powerful things that can happen. And then that leads on to this notion, which came out of Vygotsky's work, the zone of proximal development. Where do you take the student next that they wouldn't go if they didn't have an expert? And that's when this power of feedback is so powerful, to help them not just give the feedback to the student, but teach them how to hear it, how to understand it, and how to action it. And these are all the skills of the visible learner. And in our jargon, we call them the wills, the thrills, and the skills. There are skills involved, there is motivation, the thrills, and there is wills in terms of the various dispositions and the openness to experience, the having the confidence to take on challenges. And these are the essence of what we want if we're going to get improvements in maths and English and panel beating in physics.
Fantastic. So you were talking there a bit about assessment, a bit about feedback, which leads into the formative and the summative. And your views on this are quite interesting. So I'm going to ask you to just extrapolate that a little bit for the audience, particularly given that we'll be doing so much remote learning as well.
Well, your country has had a whole debate about formative and summative assessment. And if you go back and read Michael Scriven, who invented the term 60 years ago, he never used the notion formative and summative assessment. His argument was any assessment can be interpreted formatively or summatively, during the course of a lesson or at the end. When the cook tastes the soup, it's formative. When the guests taste the soup, it's summative. And so I think we've put too much emphasis on the assessment side and not enough on the during and at the end. And both during and at the end are very legitimate, particularly at the end, where you want to see how well the student has gained, how they've gained towards success. But during it also is very, very powerful. So I'm a great fan of the notion, but I'd invite you to use the notions of formative and summative evaluation, not assessment. That's a different part of the process. And unfortunately, as you know, many systems they've never seen a test they don't love. And so the testing takes over as opposed to the interpretation to help the learner progress.
So what you're calling for is a move more towards an evaluative learner, where they're able to evaluate themselves as the learner, but also evaluate their progression through the learning.
Well, actually, we've just published a book on that. The whole essence of our profession is about evaluative thinking. And then we wrote the book about the teacher as an evaluative thinking. But what you've raised is the right question. And we want the student to do, particularly in this age of internet. Oh, my goodness, the information just flows. How do you teach the student to evaluate it? Is it correct? Is it incorrect? Is there better information? Those have become pretty essential skills in today's environment for 5-year-olds, 15-year-olds, and 50-year-olds.
And I'm guessing pre-assessment is so much easier online than it is doing it in a classroom as well.
Well, it can be, but again, it's not the pre-assessment that matters. It's the interpretation and the use of the pre-assessment. Like, I think we spend far too much time in schools doing assessments that we don't actually use to inform learning. And I recommend, for instance, to the people today that the next time you do an assessment as a teacher, at the end, ask yourself, what did I learn about what I had impact on and what I didn't have impact on, who I had impact on and who I didn't have impact on, and how large, how big was that impact? And if you can't answer those questions, I think you've just wasted the kids' time. And I think this is a really powerful message to then create assessments so that you find out as a teacher about what you have taught, who you have taught, and how much you have taught. And that brings you back to saying, well, you make evaluative judgments and interpretations to then craft your next teaching act. And that's the key about assessment. It's information for teachers to inform them where to go next, much more than it is for students.
I think you were saying, I seem to remember you saying something that almost 50% of what's taught in lessons is already being covered, or the learners already know, but hasn't been secured by the teacher in terms of their knowledge of it.
Well, that was Graham Nuttall's finding from many, many hours of observing classrooms regularly for a whole school year, that in every class, 50% of the kids know what's being taught. And it's kind of like discovery. It really is a really powerful message with COVID, as schools in your country have gone out, ours have just gone back again, not assuming that what the kids know and don't know, but actually spending time discovering and doing great diagnosis about what they do and they don't know. Because one of the most simplest things in the world, if 50% of what you're teaching the kids know already, you could save that time and do much better things with that time. And so knowing about that is really so powerful.
So these slides will be available, as will the whole talk after this, so you don't need to make the notes. But I think that's a good kind of summary of what we're talking about by the learner and where we need to work on from that one. The next one we were looking at was then going to be sustainability through alignment. And this is looking very much at implementation processes, and the whole notion of impact cycles, which you brought into visible learning, which I think is really useful in terms of the people to understand. This is to deal with the complexity that we're getting in schools now, because one of the things certainly in the UK we're pretty not very good at is if we bring something new in, we try to keep hold of everything else that we've got, and then you get an incredibly crowded space where people are working very, very hard, and it's quite difficult then to manage all those different elements that you've got going on and understanding them. And I think this is where you cleaned out. And certainly if you look to other systems, the Dutch are very good. They'll take out at least as much as they're putting in. Other ones where Hong Kong, where they really learned this lesson, they took out more than they were going to plant, and say similar with Singapore. So it gave them a chance to really look at it. Sorry, John, you're looking right smile there.
Oh, look, we're very good, aren't we, at adding things. And what's more is the public, the politicians want to add more to the teachers' equations. And it kind of scares me that teachers are so diligent and fundamentally so nice. They want to have that impact on their kids and do the right stuff. But you can't do everything. And it's not about time, guys. It's about priorities. And so I would like school leaders to be much more adept at prioritizing what's valuable in their school. And as I've certainly learned, and Stephen, you've been a great teacher of me over the years as I've come out of my research bubble, implementation is the core here. And the question I'd ask each of the viewers on the session today, what's your model of implementation? Is it one of hope? Is it one of sort of cajolement and encouragement? And quite frankly, I'm not sure in education we're that good at having models of implementation. If you go into the business world, they're full of models of implementation. We hardly have any. And as you said, our politicians, our inspectorate love to bring in, here's the new thing we're going to do, and we add it on, or we tweak it, or we modify it slightly. And I think that's just not good enough. I've been a dean, a head of school and education for about 30 years of my career, and I argue that the reason I think I was reasonably okay at doing that job is I was very good at choosing what not to do. I think we need to be smarter at that. But I also think we do need to spend a lot more attention as to models of implementation. Like Michael Barber in England had his Deliverology package, and there are a few others out there, but there are hardly any. And surely as school leaders, that's the essence of your job, is implementation. And you know, Stephen, in our visible learning work, we spend a lot of time using program logic, using methods to look at shorter, medium and longer term outcomes, making sure that something like, I want to improve maths and reading. That's just 2 to 3 job at minimum. Now, I understand why certain schools would say, I'm not prepared to wait 3 years. Well, sadly, you're going to have to. And so what we do is we say, well, here are some of the early indicators. If you're on the right road to the destination you want to get to within the first 6 weeks, within the first 6 months. And my plea for school leaders is to be smarter about doing that, no matter what you're introducing in the school. It's not just bringing in a new package. It's making sure you got the implementation process right. You get asked, and I get asked often, can we have visible learning in our school? And my first reaction is, and to what is the problem that visible learning is the answer? And as you know, we spent a lot of time in the early days doing great diagnosis in schools to work out what's working really well and keeping that, what's not working so well and how do we have to change it, and what don't we need? And so my message being is I think we need to be a lot smarter about our implementation model.
I think the other thing when we looked, because I know one of my colleagues wants to do a PhD in implementation, and they looked around in the UK to try and find out if there were any professors of implementation in education. And there aren't any, which is not a great starting point. The only one that we could find was one in health. And I think they were advising the EEF at the time. And the problem you've got with health is you've got acute problems, and then you've got the long-term wellness problem. And the overall focus in health is acute problems. In education, we don't have that divide. All ours is more in the longer term. Yes, there are acute problems, but they tend to be more in child psychology and stuff like that. So when you actually look out for scientists where they can inform us, they don't inform us really well at all. So what we've ended up is a lot of advice of how to implement small elements quickly, which is great, but then this just causes that stacking up of lots of small initiatives rather than actually rooting through. And I think, you know, for all the schools we've worked with, one of the central messages that come back is, look, we had all this stuff happening all over the place, and what visible learning actually did was to sort it out for us, work out exactly which bits were bringing impact and when we could get rid of those other bits, but the bits that were bringing the impact when we really built on as strengths. So I think that was kind of a fundamental building block. And I think when I first came across visible learning, I completely underestimated how important that was.
Yeah, I would agree to that too. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that what we have is a very, very simple model of implementation that impact is to die for, where we spend a lot of time on diagnosis and discovery, working out what's working, what not so working. I find it quite amazing, Stephen, that a new principal comes or a new inspectorate comes or a new government comes and says, here's the answer. Before they've even worked out that maybe the school's doing a great job already. As my colleague Vivian Robinson says, the biggest problem in education is change. We should have improvement, and that means we need to know what's working well. And like interventions, we as educators, we have a million of them. Oh, we're very, very good at interventions. But our model says you have to tie the intervention to the diagnosis. And then you have to worry about implementation. What's the fidelity? What's the dosage? What's the quality? And here's the killer: adaptation, where teachers say, well, we have to adapt it to this class. And too often what that means is they adapt out to the innovation and adapt so it looks like they were doing what they were doing before, which may be okay, maybe not. And the evaluation is just diagnosis at the end again. So you've got evidence that your intervention and implementation makes a difference. And the key here is having that debate about what impact is. Like visible learning works on a very simple assumption. I don't think there's a person in our profession that came into it for any other reason than having an impact on kids. And we're reminding you of that. And what do you mean by impact? What do you mean by a year's worth of learning for a year's input? And these are pretty critical discussions you have to have at the classroom, the school level. And there are lots of ways you can have that kind of evidence, as you know, in our implementation. But it comes back to constantly reminding that sometimes some principals are very good at implementing things very well that have a very low impact on kids. So it's bringing that impact is to die for. Now, I acknowledge not everybody likes the notion of the word impact. To die for, it sounds a bit negative. So we recast it last year. If you go to the next slide, as getting to gold, it's the same message, but as you can see there at the bottom, if you want to take your phone out and take a picture, there's a free outline of this whole thing we're talking about here in terms of those kinds of models. But I'm with you. I underestimated. As I got older in my profession, I assumed too much that implementation was the core job of principals. I think I underestimated how hard it was and how, as you said quite correctly, there are very, very few models of implementation.
I guess there's only so much that you can do in a year when you've got something like COVID hitting and there's all sorts of congestion coming in anyway. I know Vivian Robinson did a piece for us at the World Summit that we did in Edinburgh a couple of years ago on theory of action, and it was just beautifully simple in terms of the way it looked at it, but it underestimates in some ways the sheer amount of stuff that's already happening, and it's clearing the way for that to actually happen, but also understanding what's actually happening, which is what you're talking about there.
But here's an exciting thing, Stephen. If you go back over this last week, weird year that we've had, I think what you'll see is not a single edict in the world, not a single government policy about how to react to COVID other than whether schools should open or close. And teachers have done a stunning job at adapting, many of them learning technology, all in the spirit of making sure they have the best impact on the kids they have. We've had an educator-led revolution over the last year, and I hope we don't lose that. I think there's been some stunning implementations when we removed all those pressures of above to say, you work out how to best teach these kids. We're worried about the curriculum, we'll worry about assessment for good or bad, but you work how to do it, and they have. And if you look at the evidence starting to come in, the evidence from the Netherlands, Australia, New Zealand, and some of the stuff coming in from the US, kids have gone up in many areas. Not everyone, I agree with that, but it hasn't been a disaster. And you've got to say, well, what did we do during COVID? There's a major lesson there in terms of the quality of implementation that we should not be blind to.
Absolutely. So formalising it more like this, and this is the third tenet of visible learning, developing leadership at all levels, getting everyone to think in this way. So be they first level leaders, be they school leaders as a whole, or be they group leaders, whoever you are all operating with a similar kind of cycle and model in mind, because then it's so much easier for the organisation. We're all got that shared language. We understand what an impact cycle is, and we're able to move through that. And then likewise, then teachers in their classrooms start there. So it all plugs in. And then the last but by far not the least is the learner, and how we get the learner thinking about their own learning in this way. What we're going to do now is get into the teacher development. What does teacher development look like within the kind of visible learning, and looking at the mind frames, and then on to better outcomes. And then we've got a few other bits that we're going to cycle back to. What would I do now, if you like, because that's always the challenge. So if we go back into the slide deck here, John, if that's okay. Mind frames. Do you want to give us the overview? What was your thinking behind mind frames when you came up with this idea? Because this was, Carol Dweck talked about growth mindset, and then suddenly you went, whoa, no, I prefer mind frames.
Well, Carol's a good friend, and we were talking one time about how our work is misinterpreted. And I said, Carol, yeah, one of your difficulties is you have one mind frame, you have one mindset about growth and fix, and if people don't like it, they dismiss all your work. I'm going to learn from that. I'm going to have 10. I'm going to have one repeated 10 times. And so, but I want to bring it back to what you were just talking about, Stephen. We were talking about the learner. We were talking about evaluative thinking. We're talking about implementation and the mind, the intellectual involvement in that. And so the key message in visible learning is it's much less what you do. It's much less who you are. It's how you think. And if you go to this next slide after the gold one, what we developed is the notion of 10 mind frames, and we've got them now for teachers, and these are the ones for teachers. We've got 10 mind frames, which are very similar for school leaders. We're just producing a book on the 10 mind frames for parents and looking at 10 mind frames for students. But it sounds a lot, but it's not. It's the same kind of things here, and we're trying to get in the essence here. It's about how we think. Now, here's the good news. As I travel around the world, in the days I'm allowed to travel around the world, what keeps me going is I see so much excellence. I see this thinking very vivid and very clear in many, many classes and many, many schools. And I want to capture that thinking and scale that thinking up, because it's how teachers think. And like, go back to COVID teaching. During COVID teaching, these things dominated. What we did changed, because these things dominated. Teachers were very good at evaluating their impact, having discussions on what impact meant. They were very good at seeing assessment back to them. And I'm sure many of you got to know your students much more in different ways online than you do in the classroom, because you have to listen to what they're saying more. They have to talk more aloud. Whereas in the classroom, we think, we can see in their brains. And we know that many students are very compliant and obedient whilst they haven't a clue about what's going on. And so how do you go through these kinds of different ways of thinking? And this is the core notion in visible learning. It's not that league table where we tick all the stuff off at the top and say we're doing it and we're not doing the stuff at the bottom. It's a manner of thinking that underlies it. And I'm just excited, and I bet in every school that you work in, there is some teachers who think this way already. We need to scale that up. That's what it's all about, scaling up the ways of thinking. And I think during COVID, I think our parents and our politicians realized dramatically that it was the thinking and decision-making that teachers made that made the difference, not what they did, because they tried to mimic what they did and it didn't work because they didn't have that kind of thinking power.
And it's absolutely fascinating when you start applying this in and seeing what happens, and that thinking becomes really crucial. Whenever I talk to schools or trusts who've gone through the visible learning process and say, well, what was it like 2 years ago and what's it like now? And it's kind of like it's a 180-degree turn almost. They kind of go, we were thinking of teaching, delivery, curriculum, progressive children, achievement, all those sorts of things. So now we're thinking about learning, and the whole language has changed once you change that through. We're aware of mind frames now. And we're trying to develop those because we know that they underpin them. Whereas if you try and put mind frames back to the teaching, it doesn't kind of work in the same way as at all. That, you know, it very much does support that notions that you're talking about. In fact, Sorry, I was going to say, I was just getting some feedback off of Matt, who went through visible learning about 2.5 years ago, and Darius Matt, which I know you know, and they're using all the visible learning processes still now. They don't need anything else. It's just wonderful because we've got them all embedded now. We can keep a check by going back to the mind frames. We can keep a check by using the impact cycles, but generally we're just getting on with our work because we've got full understanding of how everything aligns within the organisation.
And the other fascinating part, not one of these mind frames dictate a method of teaching. We're not taking away the agency of the teacher here. They still can make those decisions. It's turning it away from the teaching to the impact of the teaching. And I think this is one of the reasons, modestly, why visible learning has this impact, because it sits above and around rather than, it doesn't dictate what the content is. Now, of course, what you teach is critical, but we've got a whole arsenal to deal with that. I want to deal more with not only how the teacher thinks, but developing how the students and the school leaders think.
Fantastic. And so then the last one we're going to look, or the fifth one we'll deal with today, is this notion of what better outcomes look like and what are better outcomes. Now, we've obviously talked about the learner and how that one works, and it will link back to those dispositions, John. But, you know, what does impact really look like? And, you know, I'm sure you're going to.
Well, I'm always nervous answering that question, Stephen, because it's not what I think that matters. It's what the teachers in the school think. And like, sometimes it's very worthwhile shadowing a student, particularly in a high school for a day. And you walk into the first class and the teacher says, in this school, this is what we value. This is what we do. Here's how it works. Then you go to the next class and the teacher stands up and says, in this school, this is how it works. And it's so different. And the kids are impervious to it. They know it's not about that. They've worked out this game. And so I want teachers across the school to have a common understanding. But if you ask me, and if you go to the next slide, you'll see that I'm not obsessed only with achievement. I think achievement is a critical part. We wouldn't have schools if achievement wasn't part of what we dealt with. It is important to develop the skills, knowledge, and understanding in panel beating, physics, chemistry, history, music, you name it. But I also think we should have a lot more focus on progress and how we progress students and how they know what their personal bests are and how they're going. And also, under the skill notion, I want us to teach about the various strategies of learning. Can we go to the next slide, please?
Sure.
Yep. So those are the skill aspects of what I see as critical to me in impact. But I also care about whether the students feel they belong in this place called learning, whether they feel that they can have a confidence in taking on challenges. And these are teachable skills. Like if you look at the Jenkins curve, 95% of 5-year-olds want to go to school to learn. By the end of primary school, it's down to about 4 out of 10. That's a pretty important impact, to have kids want to come to school to learn. No surprise, in this day and age, I think we need to teach them about respect for others and respect for self. I also see as impact having various thrills, that motivation we're talking about. They want to invest in learning. They feel that this class is a safe place to learn. And as you know, in a lot of our work, we start by asking students about what do you do in this class when you don't know? And so many of the students, they all answer the same. I put my hand up and ask the teacher. And then we watch them. No, they don't. The only ones that put their hands up are the kids who know the answer or think they do. So what happens when you don't know? Is it an inviting place to come and learn? And so this is my list, but I would encourage anybody in the school system to have a pretty robust discussion about what they want to have an impact on. And I have a hunch in many schools they'll get very quickly past, we want to help kids pass a test. We want to help kids get a job. That's not our purpose. And our purpose is to develop them while we have them. And I think there was a really excellent paper by Gert Bester recently looking at Adolf Eichmann versus Rosa Parks. Adolf Eichmann got a job, was very good at what he did. Rosa Parks, she said no. And that's a skill we need to teach as well. And I think there are so many parts in here that we have to look at as part of impact. But my plea is this is the debate that should be happening in every school. What do we mean by impact in the school? And as you just said, Stephen, hearing it, when the students have the same language and they want to have the same kind of impact, that's magic.
I mean, that's fantastic, John. Just to help people along as well, we've been working, and John's been working with us with 8 trusts across England, which we're going to broaden up that work now. And there's about another 23 trusts wanting to work on it, on a learning survey. We've tested it now with learners to find out what their views of learning are. And the whole idea is, how do we move that narrative onto learning? And can we actually develop what we'd call a new package of goods, if you like, or a basket of measures that we could measure our own schools by, which relate directly to our learners and where they're at in that learning element, and whether it be skill, whether it be will, whether it be the thrill elements, what they are, what they mean to them, and then sharing that language out, but also understanding, are we actually developing that or not, or are we just, concentrating on the old normal kind of targets that we had. No, nothing wrong with that, but it's what we're seeing, and I think this might be useful as well, John, if you can explain why learning rather than teaching in terms of impact. What's the difference? You're a man of statistics, roughly.
Well, I'm greedy, Stephen. I want both, but I think our obsession has been about teaching, whereas I want to change that balance and have learning in that equation too. And we all know the old story, I've taught but the kids didn't learn. I want to bring those two together, and I think that we've not got isn't it fascinating that every school out there has got thousands, if not tens of thousands, of measure of achievement? How many measures of progress and learning have they got? When you go and interview students and ask them, what does it mean to be a good learner? Sadly, too many of them say a good learner is someone that comes to school well prepared, sits up straight and listens to the teacher talking. That's not what learning's about. Now, teachers often have a very rich concept of learning. Our job is to translate and make sure that students have a very rich concept of learning. And if our politicians want us to have high scores in reading and maths and achievement, we know in our heart of hearts, in our essence, that to get that, you've got to do all these things. You don't just switch on those kids that are already switched on because, hey, that's easy. It's those other kids we also have to add progress to. We have to teach them the strategies of learning. So this whole debate about learning, I don't want to imply for a moment that we should forget about what that learning is about. Of course we should. I think we should worry about respect for self and others. I just want that robust discussion with that focus on learning, because that's the essence of what we as teachers need to be really excellent at. Many are excellent, and I just want more of it.
So 2 opportunities then for you guys to get involved, and both involving John as well and involving Osiris. First of all, that learning survey will be available on the website in the next couple of weeks, so you'll be able to use that and use it with your students. It's all digital, and you get a free printout of where you are at, and eventually that will be comparative with other schools once we've got statistically enough numbers there, but that will be free for you to use. That gets launched at the World Education Summit being run on the 22nd to the 25th of March. I'm going to shamelessly plug that one because, John, you're going to be at the World Education Summit.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, with about 250 of the absolute world's top people in terms of education. And what John's done is he's arranged for the top 10 learning strategies to be covered. And can we just take a second here to bring that one up? worldeducationsummit.com, I think it's under, if you want to go on and see who else is there. But John, you've invited 10 people along to look at these 10 learning strategies, and you pick the best in the world. Would you like to say a little bit more about that?
Well, what we did a few years ago is we did similar to visible learning with achievement. We did it with the learning strategies, and we identified these top 10. Now, the complication is that it depends when you use them, but we identified these top 10. And then as we were discussing the World Learning Conference, Stephen, I said, why don't we get the people who are the expert in each of those 10 to talk about those strategies? And hey, we've done it. And I'm looking forward to listening to them. And I hope that other people are too, because to get 10 people in the world who are the best at those strategies, the top 10, it's a pretty good mix.
Right, and there's an incredible deal on the World Education Summit for groups. So if you are from a group, get in touch, and we're just going to open up the calendar now, get an appointments and see. I mean, we can do the ticket because it's digital. It just makes such a difference. When you're doing individual tickets, you've still got all the administration around it and stuff like that. But when you're doing the group, and if you can do the administration for us, it really helps. And we get tickets down to ridiculously low prices. But the great thing about this World Education Summit is we're capturing all the learning that goes on, all the speeches, all the activities that are going on in the discussions and the panels, but we're also putting activities with them and extra reading and resources, and it all goes onto a platform. And you get access for that platform for a whole year. So that's CPD for a year, if you like, or CLPL if you're up in Scotland, or PL if you're across in America. captured for you, so you can go back and dip in and dip out of that. But the focus is very much learning first, learning centre. And I'm just delighted to have John as the absolute kind of person who I would say is the top learning pusher in the world. So thank you, John, for joining us today. We're going to put that calendar up now, so you can make an appointment if you want to talk about group tickets for there, and we'll cut you some incredible deals on that. I'm hoping. No, I can't get the video, unfortunately. But if you go on the website, the video's there, worldeducationsummit.com, and you'll get the videos there. It'll tell you all about the speakers and what's going on there. John, absolutely brilliant to have us with you. And thank you very much for everyone who's joined us today. If you're doing a VL school and this is a catch-up for you, brilliant. If you're new to VL, please get in touch and Katie will help you out. And if you've already done VL and you're loving the work of John and the way it goes forward, please, we look forward to seeing you at the World Education Summit. Okay, so that'll stay open. And massive thanks to John for joining us today.
Thank you, guys.
Appreciate it. Have a really good evening, John, the rest of the evening. And everyone else, have a good morning. And if you're in the States, you can go back to sleep now. So thank you for being with us today. Really appreciate that.